Welcome, friend, to another gentle journey through history's darker corners. Tonight, we're not visiting gilded palaces or heroic battlefields. Instead, we're descending into the stone bowels of medieval Europe, where survival meant something very different than it does today. Whether you're settling in for the night or just looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you're here with me. I'd love to know where you're listening from, what city, what country, and what time it is as you press play. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all drifting through history together, separated by miles but united by curiosity. If this kind of slow, historical storytelling helps you unwind, consider subscribing. We have many more stories waiting in the shadows. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, back to a time when survival itself was an art form most never mastered. You might think surviving medieval torture was about enduring pain and walking away, but that assumption reveals how little we understand about what survival really meant in those stone-walled chambers beneath castle keeps. The truth is far more unsettling and infinitely more complex. Surviving medieval torture wasn't the end of your ordeal. It was often just the beginning of a nightmare that would follow you for whatever remained of your days. Picture this. It's 1348, somewhere in what we now call France. The stones beneath your feet are damp, worn smooth by centuries of fear and suffering. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting straw, and something else. Something metallic that catches in the back of your throat. You've just endured hours, maybe days, in the hands of men who consider pain a form of communication. And somehow, miraculously, you're still breathing. But here's what the stories don't tell you. What the dramatic retellings conveniently omit. You're not walking out of that chamber the same person who walked in. You're not even walking out whole. Medieval torture wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was designed to break you in ways that would serve as a living testament to authority's reach. Your survival wasn't mercy. It was a calculated decision to let you exist as a warning to others. Let's start with the most obvious horror: the physical destruction. Medieval torture devices weren't crude instruments wielded by sadistic amateurs. They were precisely engineered tools, crafted by skilled artisans who understood anatomy better than most physicians of their time. The rack, for instance, wasn't just about stretching. It was about systematically dislocating every major joint in your body while keeping you conscious enough to experience each pop and tear. If you survived the rack, you'd spend the rest of your days as a grotesque marionette, your limbs elongated beyond natural proportion, your joints screaming with every movement. Walking became an exercise in agony. Lifting a cup of water required planning and preparation. Your spine, stretched beyond its limits, would curve and twist in ways that made simple tasks like lying down or sitting up exercises in creative problem-solving. But the rack was almost merciful compared to some alternatives. Consider the strappado, a deceptively simple device that involved hoisting victims by their arms, which were tied behind their backs. The shoulder joints weren't designed to support the full weight of a human body in that position. Within minutes, both shoulders would dislocate with sounds that witnesses described as similar to green branches breaking. Survivors of the strappado lived with arms that hung at unnatural angles, shoulder blades that jutted out like malformed wings, and a complete inability to perform even the most basic tasks that required lifting their arms above their waist. Feeding themselves became impossible. Dressing required assistance. The simple act of reaching for something on a shelf was forever beyond them. Then there were the devices designed specifically to destroy hands and feet. The tools that turned craftsmen into beggars, that transformed capable workers into burdens on their families. The thumb screws, the foot crushers, the iron boots that slowly compressed until bones splintered like kindling. Your hands, once capable of delicate work or firm labor, became gnarled claws, the bones healed wrong, if they healed at all. Imagine being a blacksmith, your livelihood dependent on the strength and precision of your grip, only to emerge from a torture session with fingers that would never again close properly around a hammer. Or a seamstress whose hands had once moved with the grace of a dancer, now unable to thread a needle or hold cloth steady. Your survival meant watching your identity, your purpose, your means of supporting yourself crumble along with your bones. But the physical damage was only the beginning. Medieval society had no concept of trauma counseling, no understanding of what we now call post-traumatic stress. Survivors were expected to simply continue living, to pick up the pieces of their shattered existence without acknowledgement that something fundamental had been broken inside them. Sleep became a foreign concept. Every creak of floorboards, every unexpected sound, every shadow that moved wrong could trigger memories so vivid they felt like reliving the experience. The nightmares weren't just dreams. They were full-body experiences that left survivors drenched in sweat, screaming themselves awake, reliving every moment of their ordeal with perfect, torturous clarity. Many survivors developed what medieval chroniclers described as melancholia, a deep, persistent sadness that seemed to have no cure. They withdrew from society, unable to bear the presence of others, unable to explain what had changed inside them. Some spoke of feeling as though they were watching their own lives from outside their bodies, disconnected from the world around them, existing but not truly living. The social consequences were equally devastating. In medieval society, your reputation was everything. It determined who would do business with you, who would marry their children to yours, who would stand beside you in times of trouble. Surviving torture meant carrying an invisible brand that marked you as someone who had been found guilty of something serious enough to warrant such treatment. It didn't matter if you had been innocent. It didn't matter if you had been tortured based on false accusations or political convenience. The mere fact that you had been subjected to such treatment was proof, in the minds of your neighbours, that you must have done something to deserve it. Medieval justice operated on the assumption that God would protect the innocent. If you suffered, you must have been guilty of something. This social staining followed survivors everywhere they went. Former friends crossed the street to avoid them. Business partnerships dissolved. Marriage prospects evaporated. Children who had once played freely in the streets were called inside when the torture survivor walked by. You became a pariah in your own community, forever marked by experiences that most people preferred to pretend didn't exist. For those who had families, survival created an entirely different set of horrors. Your loved ones had to watch you transform from someone they recognized into a broken stranger, who flinched at unexpected touches, who screamed in the night, who could no longer perform the simple tasks that had once defined your role in the household. Children didn't understand why their parent or grandparent had become someone else entirely, someone frightening and unpredictable. The economic devastation was swift and complete. Medieval society offered no disability benefits, no social safety nets for those who could no longer work. If you couldn't perform your trade, you and your family faced destitution. Many survivors found themselves reduced to begging, the very people who had once been productive members of their communities, now dependent on the charity of others. But even begging presented challenges for torture survivors. Medieval beggars relied on evoking sympathy, but the sight of someone bearing the obvious marks of torture often inspired fear rather than compassion. People hurried past, unwilling to acknowledge what they saw, uncomfortable with being reminded of what could happen to anyone who found themselves on the wrong side of authority. Some survivors tried to hide their injuries, binding their malformed limbs, disguising their disabilities as best they could. But medieval clothing offered little concealment, and the effort required to maintain such deceptions was exhausting for people already struggling with chronic pain and psychological trauma. The religious implications of surviving torture added another layer of torment. Medieval Christianity taught that suffering was often a punishment for sin, that physical affliction could be a sign of spiritual corruption. Many survivors found themselves questioning their own faith, wondering what sins they had committed to deserve such treatment. Others became obsessively religious, desperately seeking redemption for crimes they might not have committed. Some survivors were actually barred from participating in certain religious ceremonies. The medieval church had complex rules about bodily integrity and spiritual purity. Those whose bodies had been defiled by torture sometimes found themselves excluded from communion, from confession, from the very spiritual comfort they needed most desperately. The psychological impact of this religious rejection cannot be overstated. In a society where religious participation was central to community life, being excluded from church activities was another form of social death. It reinforced the survivor's sense of being fundamentally contaminated, permanently separated from the normal world of human fellowship. For women survivors, the challenges were even more complex and devastating. Medieval women's value was largely determined by their ability to bear children and maintain households. Torture often left women unable to perform either function effectively. Damage to the pelvis, spine, or reproductive organs could make pregnancy impossible or childbirth potentially fatal. Women who survived torture often found themselves unmarriageable, their prospects for security and protection evaporating along with their physical integrity. Those who were already married sometimes faced abandonment by husbands who could no longer see them as viable partners. The medieval legal system offered little protection for women in such circumstances. The daily reality of survival meant learning to navigate a world that was no longer designed for your capabilities. Simple tasks became complex challenges requiring planning, adaptation, and often assistance from others. Getting dressed in the morning might take hours. Preparing food could be an exercise in frustration and pain. Even basic hygiene became difficult or impossible to maintain independently. Medieval architecture was particularly hostile to those with physical disabilities. Narrow staircases, high thresholds, uneven surfaces, and the complete absence of anything resembling accessibility accommodations turned every building into an obstacle course. Survivors often found themselves effectively imprisoned in their own homes, unable to navigate the physical challenges of medieval towns and cities. The weather became an enemy in ways that healthy people couldn't imagine. Broken bones that had healed improperly created joints that ached with every change in atmospheric pressure. Damaged nerves sent false signals of pain and numbness that intensified in cold or damp conditions. What had once been merely uncomfortable weather became a source of genuine agony that could last for days or weeks. As we delve deeper into this grim reality, we'll explore how medieval society's complete lack of medical understanding turned survival into a slow, agonizing descent into a form of living death that most found worse than the alternative they had initially escaped. Medical care in medieval times was, to put it charitably, more art than science, and the art in question resembled something between alchemy and educated guessing. For torture survivors, this meant that your physical wounds were treated with methods that often caused more damage than the original torture devices. The medieval physician's toolkit consisted primarily of bloodletting, purging, prayer, and a disturbing confidence in remedies that would make modern doctors weep. Consider the typical treatment for dislocated joints, a common result of devices like the strappado. Medieval physicians believed that dislocation was caused by an imbalance of the body's four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The solution, naturally, was to drain the excess blood through strategic cuts or the application of leeches. This approach worked about as well as you might expect, which is to say, it frequently killed patients who might otherwise have survived with merely permanent disability. The infection rates following medieval medical intervention were astronomical. Surgical instruments, when they were used at all, were rarely cleaned between patients. The concept of sterilization wouldn't be developed for another few centuries, so physicians cheerfully moved from treating plague victims to setting bones to delivering babies with the same unwashed hands and unsterilized tools. Many torture survivors found that the physician's cure was worse than living with their original injuries. Broken bones that might have healed crookedly but functionally were often re-broken and set incorrectly by well-meaning doctors who had learned anatomy from books written by ancient Greeks, who had never been allowed to dissect human corpses. The results were frequently catastrophic. Pain management consisted primarily of alcohol, opium when available, and herbal concoctions that were as likely to poison as to soothe. Many survivors developed dependencies on these substances, trading one form of misery for another. Medieval society had no understanding of addiction, so those who became dependent on pain remedies were viewed as weak-willed or morally corrupt. The psychological wounds festered in ways that medieval minds couldn't comprehend. Without any framework for understanding trauma, survivors were often assumed to be possessed by demons or cursed by God. The treatments for these supposed spiritual ailments were frequently more traumatic than the original torture. Exorcisms, prolonged fasting, ritual beatings to drive out evil spirits, all were considered appropriate responses to what we now recognize as symptoms of severe psychological trauma. Sleep disturbances were interpreted as visitations from demons or evidence of divine punishment. Survivors who couldn't sleep, who woke screaming, who seemed to see things others couldn't see, were often subjected to additional torments designed to cleanse their souls. Holy water was thrown on them. They were forced to undergo ritual purification, and in extreme cases, they might be subjected to further physical punishment to drive out whatever evil was thought to be tormenting them. The concept of mental illness as a medical condition simply didn't exist. Instead, psychological symptoms were viewed through a strictly religious lens. If you couldn't stop trembling, it was because you lacked sufficient faith. If you couldn't concentrate on daily tasks, it was because your mind was occupied with sinful thoughts. If you couldn't bear to be touched, it was because demons had made their home in your flesh. This religious interpretation of trauma symptoms created a vicious cycle. Survivors felt guilty about their inability to function normally, which increased their psychological distress, which manifested in more obvious symptoms, which led to more religious intervention and social condemnation. Many survivors became convinced that they were genuinely cursed or possessed, adding spiritual despair to their already overwhelming burden of physical and emotional pain. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of survival. Medieval communities were tight-knit by necessity. Survival depended on cooperation, mutual aid, and shared responsibility. But torture survivors found themselves cut off from these support networks precisely when they needed them most. Their unpredictable behavior, their physical limitations, their obvious distress made others uncomfortable and fearful. Children were particularly cruel in their honesty. They would stare openly, ask pointed questions about deformities, mimic the survivor's awkward gait or twisted posture. Adults, while more subtle, were equally unkind in their avoidance. Conversations stopped when survivors approached. Invitations to community events simply stopped coming. Former friends developed sudden urgent business elsewhere whenever the survivor appeared. This social death was in many ways more devastating than physical injuries. Humans are social creatures, and medieval humans were especially dependent on community connections for both practical and emotional survival. To be cut off from the social fabric of medieval life was to become something less than fully human in the eyes of your neighbors. The economic consequences created a downward spiral that few survivors could escape. Unable to perform their original trades, rejected by their communities, and lacking any social safety net, most survivors faced rapid descent into poverty. Medieval society was harshly unforgiving to those who couldn't contribute productively. There was no concept of society having an obligation to care for the disabled or traumatized. Begging became the only option for many. But even this degrading necessity was complicated by the survivors' history. Medieval beggars relied on inspiring pity, but torture survivors often inspired fear instead. Their visible injuries raised uncomfortable questions about authority, justice, and the possibility that such things could happen to anyone. People preferred not to think about such possibilities, so they avoided torture survivors entirely, rather than confront these disturbing truths. Some survivors attempted to leave their communities, hoping to start fresh somewhere their history wasn't known. But medieval society was surprisingly interconnected, and news travelled along trade routes and pilgrimage paths. A person's reputation often preceded them, especially when that reputation involved surviving something as notorious as torture. Starting over was rarely possible. The few survivors who managed to maintain some semblance of their former lives did so at enormous cost. They learned to hide their disabilities, to suppress their symptoms, to present a facade of normalcy that required constant vigilance and energy they could barely afford. The effort of maintaining this deception was exhausting, leaving them with little energy for actual living. Family relationships became complicated and often painful. Spouses struggled to relate to partners who had become strangers, whose personalities had been fundamentally altered by their experiences. Children didn't understand why their parents had changed, why they now flinched from affection, why they cried without apparent reason, why they sometimes seemed to be somewhere else entirely even when physically present. Many marriages dissolved under these pressures. Medieval divorce was difficult and socially stigmatizing, but abandonment was common. Spouses simply left, taking children and whatever portable wealth they could manage, leaving the survivor alone to face their demons without even the comfort of family presence. The abandoned survivors faced not only their original trauma, but also the fresh wound of betrayal by those they had most needed to support them. For parents who survived torture, watching their children's reactions was often more painful than their physical injuries. Children who had once run to them for comfort now approached hesitantly, uncertain of what they might encounter. The easy physical affection of parent-child relationships became strained and awkward when every touch might trigger a flashback, when every raised voice might send the parent into a panic. The generational trauma rippled outward in ways medieval society couldn't recognize or address. Children of torture survivors grew up walking on eggshells, never knowing what might trigger their parents' distress, learning to suppress their own needs to avoid adding to an already overwhelming burden. These children often developed their own psychological problems, creating cycles of dysfunction that could persist for generations. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval life became sources of additional torment for survivors. Winter months, when communities turned inward and people spent more time in close quarters, were particularly difficult for those who couldn't bear crowded spaces or unexpected contact. The long, dark nights provided too much time for memories to surface, for the mind to revisit experiences that daylight and activity could temporarily suppress. Harvest time, with its communal labor and celebration, highlighted the survivors' isolation and inability to participate in community life. Religious festivals, which were central to medieval social life, became reminders of spiritual questions and social rejection. Even the changing weather could trigger physical pain in poorly healed injuries, or psychological distress through associations with the conditions during their torture. The survivors who endured longest were those who found ways to create meaning from their suffering, usually through religious interpretation that cast their survival as part of God's plan. Some became mystics, interpreting their ongoing pain as a form of spiritual purification. Others dedicated themselves to caring for other outcasts and sufferers, finding purpose in service to those society had also abandoned. But even these adaptive strategies came with costs. The religious interpretation of suffering as divine will could lead to a passive acceptance that prevented survivors from seeking what little help might be available. The focus on spiritual meaning could become an obsession that further isolated them from practical concerns of daily survival. As we continue to explore this grim landscape of survival, we'll discover how the medieval understanding of justice and punishment created a system where surviving torture was often just the first stage of a lifetime sentence that no court had officially pronounced but that society enthusiastically enforced. The medieval concept of justice was built on the assumption that suffering purified the soul, that pain brought one closer to God, and that surviving extreme trauma was either divine intervention or evidence that more punishment was needed. This theological framework turned torture survivors into walking theological puzzles that medieval society was determined to solve, usually through additional suffering. Church doctrine taught that innocent people were protected by divine providence. If you survived torture, it meant one of two things. Either God had intervened to save you because you were truly innocent, or God had preserved you to endure further trials because your sins were so grave they required extended punishment. Medieval theologians debated these possibilities with the same intellectual rigor they applied to questions about angels dancing on pinheads, while the survivors themselves lived in a purgatory of uncertainty about their own spiritual status. This theological confusion created a particularly cruel form of psychological torture. Survivors found themselves constantly questioning whether their continued suffering was evidence of their guilt or their innocence. Had God saved them from death so they could repent and find salvation? Or had God condemned them to live as an example of divine justice, forever marked by their crimes? The uncertainty was maddening, and medieval society offered no clear answers. Religious authorities often viewed survivors with suspicion. If God had truly wanted to save an innocent person, wouldn't he have prevented the torture entirely? The very fact that someone had been subjected to such treatment suggested divine displeasure. Many survivors found themselves barred from certain religious ceremonies, excluded from communion, and treated as spiritually contaminated by their experiences. Some survivors became obsessively religious, spending hours in prayer, undertaking extreme penances, desperately seeking signs of divine forgiveness. They wore hair shirts, fasted until they collapsed, flagellated themselves with whips and chains, adding self-inflicted suffering to their already overwhelming burden of pain. Medieval society encouraged such displays of penance, viewing them as evidence of proper spiritual attitude. Others lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile their suffering with the idea of a benevolent God. But atheism in medieval society was not just heretical, it was incomprehensible. A person without faith was seen as barely human, excluded from every aspect of social life. These survivors faced not only their original trauma, but also the complete social death that came with religious rejection. The legal implications of survival created additional layers of torment. Medieval law assumed that torture revealed truth, that guilty parties would confess under sufficient pressure, and that innocent people would be protected by divine intervention. Survivors existed in a legal grey area that the system wasn't designed to handle. They hadn't confessed, so their guilt remained officially unproven, but they also hadn't been vindicated by their suffering, so their innocence remained suspect. This legal ambiguity meant that survivors could be subjected to additional interrogation at any time. They lived under constant threat of rearrest, of being dragged back to face the devices that had already broken them once. The mere possibility of return to the torture chamber was often enough to drive survivors to madness. Many lived in a state of constant vigilance, ready to flee at a moment's notice, never allowing themselves to feel safe or settled. The documentation of their torture became part of their permanent record, following them wherever they went. Medieval bureaucracy was surprisingly thorough when it came to recording details of criminal proceedings. Survivors found that their history preceded them to new communities, making it impossible to escape their past or start fresh somewhere else. Some survivors were required to check in regularly with local authorities, a form of probation that ensured they couldn't disappear or forget their place in the social hierarchy. These check-ins were humiliating reminders of their status as suspected criminals, forcing them to repeatedly relive their experiences through official questioning about their activities and associations. The physical environment of medieval towns and cities became a constant source of anxiety for survivors. The narrow, winding streets, the sudden corners, the deep shadows between buildings, all could trigger memories of being dragged to their torture. The sound of metal on metal from blacksmith shops, the creak of rope and pulleys from construction sites, even the innocent sounds of children playing could send survivors into panic attacks that medieval society interpreted as demonic possession or divine punishment. Many survivors developed agoraphobia, unable to leave their homes without experiencing overwhelming terror. But staying indoors brought its own torments: the darkness, the confinement, the inability to see potential threats approaching. They were trapped between fears that fed on each other, creating psychological prisons more effective than any physical restraints. The seasonal celebrations that marked medieval life became particularly difficult for survivors. Feast days, with their crowds and noise and celebration, were overwhelming for those who could no longer tolerate chaos or unexpected contact. Religious processions, with their displays of authority and reminders of divine judgment, brought back memories of being hauled before ecclesiastical courts. Even harvest festivals, ostensibly joyous occasions, served as reminders of the survivors' inability to participate fully in community life. Night brought the worst torments. In the darkness, memories became vivid and inescapable. The creaking of wooden buildings sounded like the groaning of torture devices. Wind through the shutters resembled human screams. Every shadow could hide a torturer. Every sound could signal the return of their captors. Sleep became elusive, and when it finally came, it brought nightmares so vivid they felt like reliving the original experience. Medieval sleeping arrangements, with entire families sharing single rooms and multiple people sharing beds, offered no privacy for survivors to process their trauma. Their nightmares disrupted everyone's rest. Their screaming woke the household. Their violent thrashing during flashbacks could injure bedmates. Many survivors were forced to sleep alone, another form of isolation that reinforced their separation from normal human companionship. The changing seasons brought their own challenges. Winter's cold penetrated bones that had been broken and poorly healed, creating constant aching pain. Spring's renewal mocked survivors who felt frozen in their trauma, unable to move forward or heal. Summer's heat reminded them of fever dreams and delirium from their torture. Autumn's dying light reflected their own sense of diminished life force. Food, one of medieval life's few pleasures, often became problematic for survivors. Those who had been force-fed during torture couldn't bear to eat certain foods. Others developed eating disorders, unable to keep food down or compulsively overeating when they felt safe enough to do so. Many lost their sense of taste entirely, another small death that cut them off from one of life's basic pleasures. The medieval understanding of time added another layer of difficulty to survival. Without clocks or standardized schedules, medieval people lived by the rhythms of sunrise and sunset, by the ringing of church bells, by the natural flow of seasonal activities. But trauma had shattered survivors' relationship with time. Minutes could feel like hours during flashbacks, while days could pass in dissociative hazes where nothing seemed real. This temporal distortion made it difficult for survivors to maintain any kind of routine or productive activity. They might start a task and lose hours staring into space, reliving memories. They might work frantically for days and then collapse into weeks of inactivity. Medieval society, which valued consistent productivity and reliability, had no patience for such unpredictability. As we reach the end of our journey through this landscape of medieval suffering, we see that surviving torture was never really surviving at all. It was simply exchanging one form of dying for another. The torture chamber might have been left behind, but its shadows followed survivors for whatever remained of their days, casting darkness over every moment of what others might mistakenly call freedom. The survivors who endured longest weren't necessarily the strongest or the most resilient. They were often simply the most stubborn, the most determined to spite their tormentors by continuing to exist, even when existence had been stripped of almost everything that made it worthwhile. Their survival was an act of defiance, a refusal to give their tormentors the satisfaction of complete victory. And perhaps that's the most haunting truth of all, that in medieval Europe, the real punishment wasn't the breaking of bones or the tearing of flesh. It was the slow, methodical destruction of everything that made a person human. Their connections, their purpose, their hope, their very sense of self. The few records that survive, written by monks and chroniclers who witnessed these broken souls, speak of survivors who lived decades after their torture, shuffling through life like ghosts among the living. They describe men and women who aged rapidly, their hair turning white within months of their release, their faces bearing expressions of permanent bewilderment, as if they could never quite understand how they had arrived in this strange, hostile world where their own bodies had become prisons. Some survivors developed elaborate rituals to cope with their daily existence. They might check and recheck every lock, every latch, every door multiple times before feeling safe enough to sleep. Others could only eat food they had prepared themselves, unable to trust that others wouldn't poison or drug them. Many developed an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings, constantly scanning for threats, never able to relax their vigilance even in supposedly safe spaces. The most heartbreaking accounts describe survivors who gradually lost the ability to form new memories, as if their minds had decided that no future experience could be trusted. They lived trapped in the moment of their torture, reliving it endlessly while the world moved on around them. Their families watched helplessly as their loved ones became strangers, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. Medieval chroniclers, writing with the limited understanding of their time, described these survivors as living examples of divine justice, walking sermons about the consequences of sin. They were pointed to as proof that God's judgment extended beyond death, that some crimes were so heinous they required earthly purgation. The survivors themselves often came to believe this interpretation, adding the crushing weight of assumed guilt to their already unbearable burden. But as we drift toward the end of our journey tonight, perhaps we can see these forgotten souls differently. Not as examples of divine justice or human weakness, but as testament to something more profound, the simple, stubborn persistence of the human spirit, even when everything else has been stripped away. They continue to breathe, to wake each morning, to place one broken step in front of another. Not because life was good or hope remained, but because something deep within them refused to surrender completely. In our comfortable modern world, with our therapists and our medicines and our understanding of trauma, it's difficult to imagine such complete abandonment, such utter lack of compassion or support. We can offer healing now that medieval minds couldn't even conceive. We can recognize suffering without assuming guilt, can treat wounds both visible and invisible, can offer hope where once there was only darkness. So as you settle deeper into your warm bed tonight, surrounded by safety and comfort that those long-ago survivors could never have imagined, perhaps spare a thought for them. Let their memory remind us how precious our freedoms are, how miraculous our healing, how extraordinary our capacity to help rather than abandon those who suffer. The stone chambers are empty now, their devices long since rusted away. The survivors have all passed into whatever peace they could finally find, but their stories remain, whispered in the spaces between history's grander tales, reminding us that sometimes the greatest act of heroism is simply continuing to exist when existence itself has become almost impossible. Rest now. The darkness that haunted those medieval nights has lifted. The dawn always comes, even after the longest, most terrible darkness, and in that promise, perhaps we can find the peace that eluded so many who came before us. Sweet dreams, my friend. You are safe, you are whole, and you are free.